and welcome to the video. This is Thimbles and today we're going to look at how to embroider French knots. Then we'll practice our French knots by embroidering a sprig of buddleia, gypsophila and a couple of buttercups. Okay, so let's begin. Starting in this top left-hand circle where I've just anchored my thread. To create a French knot, you bring the needle up through the fabric to the front of your work. Then you hold the needle across like this. You then wrap your thread around the needle once. Hold the thread tight around the needle. You then take the needle back down through the fabric near to where you originally came up. Keep the thread in your left hand tight around the needle and pull the needle and thread through gently. Once most of the thread has been pulled through, you can let go of the thread. So again, bring the needle up through the fabric. Hold it straight like this. Wrap your working thread around the needle, pulling the thread tight around the needle. Then take your needle back through the fabric near where it came up. Keep a hold of the working thread in your left hand, keep it taut around the needle, pull the needle and thread through. So once more, bring the needle up through the fabric, hold it straight, wrap your working thread around the needle, keeping that thread taut around the needle, then take your needle back through the fabric near where it came up. And that is how you form a basic French knot. French knots have a reputation for being fiddly. A common mistake is that people don't keep the thread wrapped tightly around the needle as they pull the needle and thread through. They allow it to go slack. That's certainly the problem I had when I first started trying French knots. Because I was allowing the thread to go slack and unwind from around the needle, the knots themselves never formed. So to avoid that, keep your working thread firmly wrapped around the needle. You don't need to strain when pulling it, you don't want it to be too tight either, else you'll struggle to pull the needle and thread back through the knot, but tight enough that it doesn't unwind from around the needle. So you can make the French knot larger by adding more twists around the needle. In the first circle we went around the needle once, but in the second circle we'll go around the needle twice, like this. For my own pieces of work, I often go around the needle twice. It's the way I first learned how to stitch, and while I will vary it, sometimes using 3, sometimes using 1, this is the most common number of twists I use. Often when I'm adding French knots to my work, I'm not looking for a large or standout embellishment, just something relatively subtle that adds a bit more texture and interest to a piece. So in this final circle, I'm going to wrap the floss 3 times to create an even larger knot. The effect you're hoping to achieve will determine how you want to approach completing your French knots. The more twists around the needle, the larger and looser the knot will get. Basically, the more twists you add, the more they become like unruly bullion knots. As with so many things in embroidery, there are no set rules here, but if you're looking for a small, neat knot, then I'd probably not go beyond 3 twists around the needle. So for these first 3 circles we filled, they've all used 2 strands of DMC embroidery floss, but they've all got different number of twists. So for the first circle, it has the smallest and also the tightest little knots. They don't move around at all as I'm trying to push them. The second circle with French knots made using 2 twists has larger knots, and there is a bit of movement as I push them. The third circle with 3 twists has the largest knots, which move around the most as I push them here. But they're still quite neat and they're still quite immovable. So they're still pretty nice French knots. So another way to change the approach to French knots is to change the number of threads you use. So on this bottom row, let's look at the effect of using a different number of threads rather than twists. In this first circle, I'll be using 1 strand of DMC embroidery floss, and I'll be wrapping the thread around the needle twice. Before I start to fill in this first circle, I want to illustrate a problem you may encounter when using only 1 or 2 threads of embroidery floss. And it's that the French knot you might form might be so small that it's easily pulled down through the fabric and it just disappears. But this is a really easy problem to fix. Instead of going back through the fabric through the hole you originally came up through, you go back down near to it, leaving a bit of fabric in between. Then your French knot can be supported by that little bit of fabric. So this is something I personally run into a lot, a problem that I've run into, because I embroider so much with only 1 or 2 strands of embroidery floss. But if you're working with a greater number of threads or perhaps a more densely woven fabric, you probably won't have a problem. You can see I sometimes struggle to get the end of my needle through the knot, particularly here where I'm using 3 strands of embroidery floss. This isn't because I've held the thread too tight around the needle, but rather because I've used the wrong size needle for the number of threads. So part of the function of a needle is it's used to push apart the fabric fibres to create a gap large enough to pull the thread you're working with through your fabric. So if you've threaded it with too many threads, the eye of the needle becomes too bulky to fit through the gap the needle has formed, and you have to give it a bit of a tug. So I recommend moving up needle sizes alongside the number of threads you use. So for the first circle, where I've only used 1 strand of floss, I've used a size 10 needle. For the second, I've used a size 9 needle. And then I continue to use the size 9 needle for the 3 strands. That's why I need to give the 3 strands a little tug to get it through. So I'd recommend moving up to an 8. There's no one rule that every time you use 3 strands of embroidery floss, you must use a size 8 needle. But just in this case, I think I've stuck with a size 9 needle and it's made the French knot a little bit more difficult to do. Okay, so before I complete the final circle, I want to show you how I embroider with 6 strands that makes it easier than embroidering with 5. The reason that using 6 threads is easier is because I only use 3 strands, but I cut them twice as long as I normally would. I then pass those 3 strands through the eye of the needle and tie both ends together. This way, there's only ever 6 strands passing through the fabric at a time. It means embroidering with 6 strands is actually a lot easier than embroidering with 5. Okay, so here all our circles have been filled in and you can see the slightly different texture and appearance of each circle, with the fewer threads being more flat, more grain-like, kind of like sand, where you've got these much bigger knots which also stand a lot taller out of your embroidery piece. And you can mix and match these to create patterns, to create different textures. It's a really versatile little stitch. Okay. So hopefully you're pretty comfortable with doing French knots now. So I'm going to show you a couple of different flowers you can use them for, starting with this sprig of buddleia here. I recently put out a video showing how I embroidered a red admiral with a buddleia border. In that video, I used the colours 153, 554 and 3041. So here I thought I'd choose a slightly different selection of colours, and those colours are 33, 34 and 153. I'm going to quickly do the stem and leaves using 3348 and 3363. I'm going to use stem stitch for the stem and just long stitch for the leaves. I'm using a size 9 embroidery needle and 2 strands of DMC stranded floss, and I'll be using that for the stem, the leaves and the buddleia itself. Now for the buddleia, I'm going to start with the middle shade, the 33, and I'll fill most of the buddleia using this colour, leaving a bit of space here and there, especially around the top and the bottom of the buddleia, just for some highlights and some shading. As you can see while I'm doing the French knots, I'm wrapping the thread twice around the needle as well. I'll then take 34, the purple I'm using for the shadows, and I'll add that where I think there will be shadows. So I add a greater number of shadow French knots around the bottom of the flower, but add fewer and fewer as I approach the top. I then add some French knots in 153 towards the top of the buddleia for the highlights. I do admit, once I added this, I thought it was a little bit bright. I'd probably recommend a slightly darker shade, but the general gist is still there, that these are going to be highlights. And there we have our completed buddleia. So next we'll move on to stitching gypsophila, otherwise known as baby's breath. I start by adding the stems and these spiky little leaves. Similar to the buddleia, I'm using a size 9 needle and 2 strands of DMC embroidery floss. This time I'll be using split stitch to complete the stem. I'll be using the green threads 3345 and 935. Once the stems are complete, I start adding the French knots in little clumps around the top of the stems using thread 3865. And here we have our beautiful sprig of gypsophila. It's a lovely decorative flower to use, very simple to embroider and very effective. The final flower we're going to embroider is a buttercup, and we'll use the French knots to fill in just the centre of the flower in this instance. So first I'm embroidering the buttercup stem using thread colours 469 and 470. For the flower petals, I'm using colours 3821 and 3820. I first outline them with split stitch and then I fill the petals using long and short stitch. Now, outlining them with split stitch helps raise the petal edges a little and gives them a nice clean edge, but you don't have to outline them with split stitch if you don't want to. You could just fill them in with long and short stitch or even satin stitch. And now I'll begin filling in the centre of the flower using French knots. I'm actually going to use all 6 strands for the central knot and then surround that central large knot with smaller French knots using 2 strands of floss. In all instances, I'm wrapping the thread around the needle twice. By mixing French knots with other stitches, such as the long and short stitches here, you can give your embroidery a really interesting mix of textures, and it can add a further feel of realism to your piece, since flowers often have a mixture of textures in them. Also, personally, I like using a range of stitches because I think it makes an embroidery piece more fun to embroider. It's nice to sort of work on one section of long and short stitch and then work on a different section of French knots. Both add something very different to a piece. So there you have it, a bit of a closer look at French knots. I've used French knots in a number of pieces now. When embroidering an orange tip butterfly, I used them in a similar manner to the buttercups we just embroidered. So I added them to the centre of my cuckoo flowers. While embroidering a nuthatch, French knots were used alongside turkey stitch to create realistic moss. French knots can also be used for more generalised decoration, such as adding them to lattice work to create a really pretty fill stitch. And these are just a couple of examples. There's so many different ways you can use this stitch. Anyway, that's all for this tutorial. I hope you feel more confident now with French knots. I hope you've enjoyed watching as well. If you have, please let me know by liking and subscribing to the channel. If there's any other stitches you'd like me to explore, you can let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.